Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Orchardcast. As always, I'm your host, Jeremy Appel, speaking to you from Amiskiche, Wisconsin, otherwise known as Edmonton. The federal NDP has some soul searching to do after facing the worst electoral result in its history in last month's federal election. The party, which now has just 7 MPs, selected its interim leader, Vancouver Kingsway MP Don Davies, a couple weeks ago. 3 MPs, Leah Gazan in Winnipeg, Lori Idlu in Nunavut, and Jenny Kwan in Vancouver, wrote a May 10th letter to the party executive criticizing a lack of input in selecting Davies as their interim leader. This letter was leaked the following week to the Globe and Mail. In it, they said the party's approach to selecting Davies mimics the practices that have led to the worst electoral outcome for the NDP in decades. Gazan, Idlu, and Kwan released a statement calling it unfortunate that a letter intended as communication for the party executive and council was leaked to the media the day after the Globe and Mail story came out. The 3 MPs said they've got nothing but respect for their colleague Davies and were simply attempting to invite a dialogue regarding democratic approaches to decision making. Meanwhile, the party establishment has made it clear that they want the upcoming leadership race to be brief and have an entry fee 5 times higher than it was in 2017 when Jagmeet Singh won on the first ballot. Both these moves would make it more difficult for an outsider candidate to shake the race up and fundamentally change the party's trajectory, taking power away from the insiders. Matt Fodor is the author of From Latent to Sing, the 20-year conflict behind the NDP's deal with the Trudeau Liberals. He joins me momentarily to place the NDP's historic rebuke in the appropriate historical context. Matt Fodor, welcome to the Orchardcast.
Good to see you again, Jeremy.
Yeah, second time guest. I remember I had you on for the first time when your book came out, From Latent to Sing. Now, of course, we've got some pretty major developments on the NDP front, so I figured it would be a good time to check back with you about and hear sort of how you would place this electoral decimation that the NDP experienced in this year's election in the broader context that you outline in your book, which goes from the party's sort of height under Jack Layton, at least in terms of votes received and seat count, and then its gradual decline under Tom Mulcair and then Jagmeet Singh. So with that in mind, what do you make of the results and how do they fit into what you've observed about the party over the past 20 years more?
Yeah, I think it shows the sort of the limitations of the this sort of third way strategy that the NDP had been pursuing since Layton. Yes, they pursued this third way strategy and a where the NDP tried to tack to the ideological center and also a sort of modernization strategy, which put heavy emphasis on the leader and a movement away from sort of the grassroots um, uh, democracy in the party to the extent it existed. It kind of it yielded enormous success under Jack Layton in 2011, and I think that was read as a vindication of this being a very successful strategy. But I think that that the Layton breakthrough. I think most would agree now was based on very specific conditions that were going on in Quebec at the time. The failure of the Liberal Party under Ignatieff and at the time, and Dion before that, and also just Jack being a very charismatic guy and all the stars kind of aligning. And I think they thought that they had a working this was a working strategy, but it has not been able to go through with two leaders. And I think even I think the positioning of the Liberal Party, the revitalization and positioning the party to a more a progressive identity, also sort of ate the NDP's lunch, if not ate their lunch, at least kind of made them seem redundant. And I think that he kind of got squeezed into this, you know, liberal conservative binary that did the NDP in as well.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, you would think if that was the right strategy, this consultant,
Mm-hmm.
led approach
Mm-hmm.
of tacking to the center
Mm-hmm.
and delivering electoral wins like the party has experienced provincially here in Alberta and BC, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, most provinces.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, why didn't it work under Thomas Mulcair, right? That's the question I don't think the sort of party establishment
Yeah.
is able to answer.
Yeah.
Um, Beyond arguing that that election was actually a unique set of circumstances.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
just like this one was.
yeah, I mean, all elections are,
Mm-hmm.
to some extent, but I, mean, I guess just a refresher. You have Mulcair, pivots the party even further to the centers, talking about balanced
Mm-hmm.
budgets, while also, expanding some social programs like
Mm-hmm.
childcare and
Yeah.
pharmacare. Um, and that doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
The party loses half its seats. The Liberals
Mm-hmm.
shoot from third to first. And then there's a leadership race. And Jagmeet Singh is chosen as leader. How would you characterize his tenure as NDP leader? Because I think it, in some ways, was a departure from the Leighton Mulcair approach, but in other ways was a product of that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Sing did reposition its messaging. I think what I think the lesson learned in 2015 is never get outflanked on the left by the Liberals. I think they learned that lesson because the Mulcair went third way on overdrive, and the only place Trudeau could, there was more space for Trudeau to position himself to the left of Mulcair than there was to be in between Harper and Mulcair. So then, then they got so he was able to outflank the Liberals. The Trudeau was able to outflank the Mulcair and the NDP on infrastructure spending, on taxes, on all sorts of things. And the lesson I think learned from that is okay. We got it. We can't. We can't. We can't. We must assert our progressive identity. I think that was something that was part of it, and that's also why the deal was done. I mean, the Liberals, it was large. It did accomplish um, some progressive form, so it was largely the 2021 Liberal platform that was the content of the deal. I think dental care and anti-scab legislation, I guess, being the exceptions. But I think that I would describe his positioning, but I think in terms of organization, It remained fundamentally the same consulting class, using, but now we know that, AOC is a good brand or something like that. So maybe Green New Deal's kind of a good brand. We'll do that. So they do position themselves more, but I think they left the kind of structure in place. And I think a lot of what sustained social democracy in Canada, like the old the connections that it used to have in working class communities across the country, really just eroded. And I think it became very much a personality cult almost around the leaders. I think is kind of typical of the politics. Very much our politics is being driven in that direction generally, and the NDP is no exception. Um, and I think that I think the problem was that he wasn't. I think it was largely keeping the same structure in place and not being able to really distinguish themselves too much to the Liberals. For a lot of voters, they didn't see a huge difference between Justin Trudeau style liberalism and Singh style social democracy. People didn't see a big difference.
Yeah, it's interesting because it seems like the NDP was put in a box where
Yeah.
when Trudeau's uh, fortunes were down, they were dragged down with
Mm.
him.
Yeah.
And then when Trudeau was replaced with Carney,
Yeah.
a lot of voters were like, well, not that much of a difference between the NDP and Liberals, so
Yeah.
might as well just vote Liberal, right? Because
Yeah.
it's a two-horse race,
Hmm.
which I think led to a lot of good New Democrats losing their seats,
Absolutely. Yeah.
like Blake Desjardins in my riding,
Hmm.
Nikki Ashton,
Yeah.
of course, Matthew Green,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
a
A
lot
lot of
of
a lot of
really,
casualties.
yeah. Um, but one thing that is noticeable, and that was happening before um, Carney
Hmm.
became leader of the Liberal Party, was like it was happening over a matter of years. Was the Conservatives really gaining support in among working class
Yes.
constituencies? I
Hmm.
mean, look at Windsor.
That's stunning to see.
Yeah, right. I mean, there's two seats there that the Conservatives grabbed from the
That's,
NDP.
that's right. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Yeah, Brian Massey's seat, and who's the other MP?
Oh, I forgot the other one. I think they got. Did they lose? I think they lost. Did they lose? I think they lost one Windsor seat in 21 and the one in 25. I think. Did
Oh,
Massey?
okay. So it's
Yeah.
been a long term decline, right?
Yeah. It has been a long term decline, but now they're out. Now they're out of Windsor. They're out of Ontario, and it's just stunning. And you look at these results. I mean, you look at you. Not only are they out, but you look at the results. Yeah, Massey, for example, was a 25-year veteran, one of the longest serving members of all the parliamentarians. And this was, so he was defeated. And you look at the seats where the NDP had been out for some time, like the Windsors, like Windsor Essex, or if we go to say Hamilton East or Nickel Belt, you see this NDP in single digits. Like it's real, like they're not even getting the deposit. Like they're like it's not even a significant base of support in these industrial working class communities across Ontario is really stunning. Really, I mean, it was this was like I'm actually, yeah, it's really stunning to see that, and the Conservatives are picking up um, with a populist message, and politics is now being framed, you know, as now politics is between like sort of establishment centrist liberalism versus populist conservatism, right? And there isn't really there isn't like people don't really see a major, there's not a class based democratic socialist or social democratic laborist option that's attracting masses of people. And when you have that option, a segment of the working class is going to would will pick the populist conservative option over the establishmentarian liberal. And the NDP, and it's stunning to see how the Tories really did play up, really did tailor their messaging to the working class, like boots not suits, and and talked about how like they would attack Carney for being a banker, and they would I read a good article by Martin Lukash has that really good piece in the Breach about how they're even some ways consciously saying, yeah, why should let the left have the populist economic populist message? We can do that too. Like it was even conscious, and it's really striking to see Polyev, who really, if you look back at him, like in his early career, he was like a Ayn Randian campus conservative type, not a pop, not much of a populist, right? But he's really, he really has messaged it. I think it started with O'Toole and Ford as well. Like this is happening. You could see it in other countries with Boris Johnson, or with Trump for that matter. Like there is this sort of like appealing to the working class with a sort of a bit of an economic populist message and a bit of a cultural conservative message. And that was and that worked. There was a poll of a post-election survey, I think it was by Abacus, and they asked where these people who voted previously had in previous election 2021 had voted. How did 2021's NDP voters go this time? And you found only a third returned to the party, because it went from 18% to 6%. 42% went liberal, and 20% went conservative. And you're losing and I think the conservative one, I think the conservative losses were more damaging, as they seem to be in places where they were actually that seemed to even cost them more seats. Like a lot of I guess a lot of the liberal losses were in Toronto and places like that, where they didn't have seats to begin with. But there was really a lot of bleeding on that side. And I think it's this is a trend where the new fault lines are moving away from like a left-wing articulation of class politics, and sort of like this liberal conservative binary, which the NDP is not, which is bleeding, but leads to their base bleeding both ways.
Yeah, and I was hoping you could talk a bit about how the way the party is structured and functions might have contributed to this exodus of like working class voters to the conservatives and liberals as well. I think it's one thing, you know, to talk about how the NDP weren't really offering anything that was fundamentally distinct from what the Liberals were. Running ever so slightly to the left of Liberals seemed to have been Singh's
Yeah,
approach.
yeah,
But that's in terms of like policy. But in terms of like the way the party operates, how did it let these working class voters like fall through its grasp?
yeah. It's a question I think that needs to be researched and interested. Like, why? Who are these? I think we need to hear more from rather than looking at numbers and stats. It'd be good to actually hear and from people who switch, because I'd like to know what it was. I think we have some ideas, but it would be interesting to hear from uh these voters and why they felt that the conservatives, or for example, may have been a more appealing to them. um it's yeah it's really striking that the connection between NDP and Labor is probably as weaker than they've ever been. Really, I mean, I think there was a I have a I think there was a now let's remember that in Canada they've never had they've never formed the federal government, and they've never been like British Labour, or many Swedish Social Democrats, where you had like the majority of they used to get the majority of manual workers, and the never NDP never had that. But there was links, and you could see it in places like Sudbury or Windsor. I have a colleague who studies in,
Edmonton.
yeah, Edmonton for sure. Yeah, Edmonton. Um, Nanaimo, places like that. and I have a colleague, acquaintance, friend, and he studies the NDP as well, and he's from Sudbury, and he said when his mother, and he's about, and he's old, he's like, he's an older guy, maybe about in the 60s, I guess, and he said when he was growing up, like his mother just called the NDP the Labor Party, it's like small L Labor Party, like that connection was there in certain pockets of the country where there was a history of trade unionism and some class consciousness, and that's really just um, eroded. I think the unions too. We need to talk about the unions. I think as well. I think there's been that relationship. This has obviously um, less is obviously less than it was. We can trace it back to NDP governments such as Bob Rae's, which had which was elected with significant support from working class Ontarians, and then and then put in policies like the social contract, which alienated unions and labor. And I think also that, but I mean, unions themselves have changed, and I think they've moved towards in the private sector in particular, they've kind of moved to a more business unionist perspective. For example, like you can look at the CAW in the 80s and 90s. Their influence, they were really a force of economic nationalism and progressive unionism, and it was I think labor. I think at the end of the day, organizing workers is how you get a mass base for a left wing party. And CAW obviously is folded into, it's no longer exists. It folded into Unifor, and since you can go back to things like Buzz Hargrove embracing Paul Martin in Windsor 20 years ago and giving him the jacket, they started that relationship started eroding as they moved to a more pragmatic politics, and now uniform is not a not Unifor is not really that kind of force anymore. So I think there's been, I think unions too. I think the culture as well. I think we've had a culture where the solidarity is sort of really broken down in a lot of ways. People, we've now had 40 years of neoliberalism, and neoliberalism is every much as much of an economic or political um, philosophy or mode of governance. It's also has a cultural effect, I think, on us all. And I think I think Margaret Thatcher said that economics is about the is good. It talks about the soul as much with the soul as it is about the economic policy itself. Um, so I think, yeah. So I think there's been. I think there's a complexity of factors. In other words, I guess what I'm saying is, there's an array of factors, and of course, we're seeing social democracy, labor parties all over the world. This is happening to, like, Keir Starmer, who's now getting now not exactly my favorite person these days. Is he won his landslide was with a smaller percentage of the vote than Corbyn. So even a winning Labour Party, only had 33% of the vote. The German Social Democrats, they only got 16% of the vote in the last election in Germany, the lowest percentage they got since the 19th century, sometime in the 19th century. So we're starting to see, broader, the Social Democratic Labor Party, links with unions and workers is obviously less than what it is, and but although it is partly because social democratic parties have moved away from class-based messaging and people vote more like free agents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Susan Delacourt has an interesting book called Shopping for Votes
I know,
that
yeah, yeah,
talks about how parties now are, have adopted modern, marketing and advertising
that's right.
techniques,
Yep.
and are selling a brand to
Mhm.
consumers.
Yeah,
So, yeah, it is much less ideological than, it was certainly before neoliberalism, but even, you know, in its earliest days, like in the 80s, Ed Broadbent, who at the time was considered to be on the more pragmatic centrist
Hmm.
wing of the New Democrats by today's standards is, I mean, well to the left of where
Ab-
Jagmeet Singh was.
Absolutely. He
Um,
yeah.
but I think Singh, what I've noticed is when it comes to really the real like populist issues, the
Hmm.
economics, you
Hmm.
know, chief among them, his embrace of this, sort of tax the rich rhetoric and talking about income inequality has been really half-hearted. Like it doesn't seem
Yeah.
like that's in his comfort zone. It seems like he's more comfortable talking about racial justice, right?
Yeah.
Which is important,
Yeah.
but
And that's
and
you got
I
to, yeah,
think it,
exactly. Go ahead.
yeah, and I've heard many people make that observation, and I think you look back to the leadership race, right, in
Hmm.
2017. I
Yeah.
mean, it's easy to forget that Singh won overwhelmingly. Like on the
Hmm.
first ballot,
Hmm.
I don't have the percentage in front of me, but
53.8%.
yeah,
But he won an outright majority. Actually, it's the same exact, pretty much identical percentage that Jack Layton got in his race. They both had
oh, is that
53,
right?
54%. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um, now Charlie Angus was a very distant runner-up in that.
That he was,
Do
yeah.
you think things would look different if he had become the NDP leader, or is the party machinery that left where we are so entrenched that it wouldn't have made a difference who the leader was?
It's a very difficult question to know. I don't know. He may have had he may have held, like, some of the Northern Ontario and industrial seats in a better way than Singh did. Maybe held that vote like they still do it, provincially, in Ontario. Um, but and the other thing too is that Singh didn't deliver anything in terms of being able to win in the metropolitan and suburban seats. They were saying he was going to win. He had this ability to break through. In fact, that was a huge part of his. The Toronto Star was very pro Singh in his in when the endorsed Singh in the leadership race, and a lot of that was like he's appealing to new constituencies. He's also somebody who's you know he's a charismatic guy. And Singh didn't deliver anything in terms of bringing in new constituencies or anything like that. So I don't think it could have really gotten worse with Angus, because I don't think the seats that they were getting are the seats they normally get anyway. That they're that's but so I don't think he added anything. But in terms of and would the Tory how would the Conservatives have responded to would they have would the ND would the Conservatives have been able to try out this messaging as successfully if Angus was doing the kind of populist progress populist, I guess, old NDP style. Interesting to know. I don't know, but I don't what and I don't really know, because there but I'll just say that I don't think Singh brought much in.
Yeah, I remember talk about how he could win in Brampton
Yeah,
and
third place.
Surrey,
Yeah, yeah,
and yeah, it never materialized.
yeah,
Throughout his leadership, the NDP was just clinging to what it had,
yeah.
and 2019, 2021, it
You had to go to
remained,
Burnaby to get a seat.
yeah.
Then you,
And it remained almost steady in 2019,
yeah,
2021, but then 2025 it was just a total deluge, and
yeah, yeah,
we
yeah.
see we
It,
see the results of that now.
I think you could kind of see it coming in a way, just in the sense that they really seem to be beaten by this conservative attacks on the NDP. Like, and ironically, in some ways, it was too successful for the Tories, because they normally with 40, they normally with 41% of the vote, that's majority government, but not when the NDP is, not when the NDP is in single digits.
Right, and I think in that respect, Polyev going after the NDP, right, talking about sellout Singh,
Yeah,
was actually counterproductive, right, because it um, it certainly didn't help the NDP's polling numbers.
Hmm.
Because, as we saw, all the voters who are voting against the conservatives rather than for something in particular are just going to vote liberal, even in ridings where they should probably vote, New Democrat
Yeah,
or
yeah.
Green.
It's striking too that that they were not able to develop any kind of. I mean, considering who they were running up against. I mean, Carney, from an NDP point of view, you'd think Carney be like the kind of liberal you'd want to run against. Like he's the Wall Street banker liberal. I mean, he's like almost like the perfect candidate, the perfect person to be able to draw a distinction with. Um, and yet, people voted strategically, and Carney didn't. And I don't. Some people are saying that strategic voting was a psyop, or people were like tricked or whatever by the liberals. But Carney didn't run on anything progressive really at all. He positioned himself very much what he governing. He seems to be positioned himself and seems to be governing exactly as you'd kind of expect. And I think people kind of knew what Carney was about. I think a lot of people who were strategic voters, maybe it just got almost habitual in a sense that people were so used to doing it under Trudeau that you do it a third time with Carney. But I think people knew that even if they preferred a more progressive liberal, I think they knew they were what they were voting for with Carney. But I do find it striking. And yet people were so a lot of people who were progressive were just so concerned about a conservative government. I think they were willing to overlook that. But at the same time, I'm struck that the NDP was unable to with the Liberals moving quite a bit to the right from where they were under Trudeau, and the NDP losing ground is um, is really quite striking. And it's that the people either felt that Carney was the man needed for the times, or they felt that if they or they felt that Polyev was the one capturing the message of change.
So I wanted to talk about, of course, it was this bitter defeat for the NDP
Hmm.
is an opportunity for the party to change its direction. There's going to
Yeah,
be a leadership race. And the party is already, you can tell there's a piece recently in the Globe and Mail
yeah,
that spoke with these party insiders who are all
yeah.
agreeing that the race needs to be quick and they need someone who can replicate what the party has done on a provincial level and actually form government, right? Um, Alberta,
Yeah,
BC, Saskatchewan, Manitoba right now,
yeah,
I think would probably be the model
yeah. Hmm.
because Wab Canoe is quite popular still.
Yeah,
Um, and it seems like they're deliberately trying to, for